Okay. Well, thank you for preempting your happy hour to attend. My name is Matt McGlone. I'm a professor of communication here at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm also a faculty fellow at the Center for Identity at UT. This is the first of its kind think tank devoted to issues of digital identity and identity theft in the United States. And I've been affiliated with the center for, I guess I first attended a meeting in September of 2012. I'm going to talk to you about some research that I'm doing for the center on the issue of framing. I'll introduce what I mean by that and how it has an impact on how people make decisions about privacy. So as I mentioned, I first started working for the center back in the fall of 2012. And after I had gone to a couple of meetings and learned about all the wonderful things that Suzanne and her staff were doing, I actually attended the Texas State Fair in October. They have a state fair, and they have, some new things at the state fair, but they have some of the old standards. And you remember the old guessing game where you have somebody who would guess your weight, age, and birth month? And it gave me some pause thinking about that. Because talk about dated, particularly in an age in which you could, if somebody has a laptop, they could figure out your weight, height, date of birth, email address, social security number, and many passwords. This is the age we're living in, and it is important that we understand that while consumers are concerned about this issue, in fact, one even might argue that consumers are becoming cynical about this issue, that the cynicism that we see portrayed, particularly in clever editorial cartoons and things like this, aren't necessarily a particularly good gauge of consumers' understanding of these issues, any more than if you watch The Daily Show on a regular basis, you'd assume that there were a bunch of left-leaning liberals who were electing liberal senators and representatives to Congress. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about consumers' understanding of the issues around identity and how they make judgments about their privacy. At its core, privacy is an issue of uncertainty. Uncertainty, the way that many social scientists think about it, is simply incomplete information. There's a good side to uncertainty. The good sense of uncertainty is what we consider personal privacy. To the extent that monitors have incomplete information about me, that is the vestige of privacy that I enjoy. There are bad sides to privacy as well. In particular, there's lots of concern among many users of the internet about how much information various private and public agencies have about what legal monitors are looking at and what they're doing with these data. So there's incomplete information about the legal monitors. The ugly, of course, is that we have even less information about what illegal monitors are doing with these data, where they're getting them, what they're capable of doing. So uncertainty is intrinsically bound up with any issue of privacy. And the way that economists, actuaries, other people that delve into issues of probability and risk think about this is they make a graph between an outcome, so this could be some sort of outcome of a decision that is made or a process that one engages in, and the probability that this particular decision will yield an outcome. Now, many people are going to, particularly when it comes to privacy, are going to be in the ignorance domain, in which they don't know the outcomes, they don't necessarily know the outcomes of identity theft, either protecting themselves from it or it actually having to them, nor do they know the likelihood that it would happen. There are others who know that there are all sorts of negative things that might happen as a result of releasing information, be it not protecting accounts with good passwords or posting sensitive information on a social media site, etc. So they might know that there are some negative outcomes that can come from doing this, but they might not know its probability. And the way that an economist would think about this is they're in the uncertainty sphere. A third group are in the risk awareness sphere, in that they not only know the outcomes, but they also know their probabilities. That doesn't mean that they necessarily know that this particular transaction is going to lead to an identity theft, or this particular posting on Facebook is going to lead to some compromise of reputation, but they know the likelihood in these contexts. It would be great if people were in the risk awareness cell. But the truth is that the vast majority of consumers across the digital universe are largely in the uncertainty area. And there are lots of privacy issues, privacy decisions that are made under uncertainty in these contexts. So the sorts of decisions I'm going to be talking about today, people making judgments about which sites can I trust with my credit card information, what information is okay to post on Facebook, how often should I change my passwords, what should an ID theft protection plan cost me? In all these cases, people might make a guess. They might make some guesses better than others, but they're making these judgments, these decisions under uncertainty. So, as I say, most consumers are uncertain about privacy threats. They know the outcomes, but they don't necessarily know the probabilities that these particular outcomes are going to happen, or how much protection they get from having strong passwords or belonging to LifeLock and that sort of thing. And there's a large body of research in behavioral economics, in cognitive psychology, cognitive science, communication studies, on how people make decisions under uncertainty. And one of the critical concepts in this area of research is the notion of a frame. And by frame here, it's just a simple word describing how the problem, the options, and the outcomes that are presented to a decider can have sometimes some pretty dramatic influences on the way these people make decisions. And so I'm going to be talking to you about, it says in the abstract 4 or 5, I'm going to be talking about four frames that can have a significant effect on privacy decisions. I will first introduce the frame, give you some examples of it in a very simple consumer context, and then describe each one in a privacy context. So the first one I'm going to talk about is called nominalization. And I realize that's a frightening word, but it is a $10 word for a nickel concept. Nominalization is a fancy way of saying, I've heard it described as nouning. And nominalization occurs when you use a noun to describe an action or a property. So think about, you've heard people say things like, we had a discussion about it over lunch, as opposed to saying, we discussed it over lunch. Or the police are conducting an investigation, as opposed to the police are investigating. Or what is your availability tomorrow, as opposed to, are you available tomorrow? In each of these cases, we describe a process, discussion, a property, say difficult versus difficulty, or available versus availability, and you describe it as a noun as opposed to either the verb that we normally use to describe processes or the adjectives we use to describe properties. And for the academics in the room, you and I know that this is the language that we use. This is academic language. For the policy wonks among you, you know that this is a language of policy wonks. And it is useful for us to talk, for academics and policy wonks to talk about in terms of nominalizations. It is not necessarily a good thing to talk to the typical consumer about it in these situations. Helen Sword had a wonderful piece in the New York Times a few years ago in which she was bemoaning the proliferation of nominalization in discourse, in public discourse. And she said, the problem here is that they're basically zombie nouns that cannibalize active verbs and suck the lifeblood from adjectives. Steven Pinker has a wonderful book that just came out on style, and he said that it creates a problem in that it introduces abstractions where concrete ideas belong. And what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to show you some evidence that shows exactly why we should be worried about it, particularly in the privacy space. And the issue here is that it reduces the reader's attention and interest to the material, particularly when you use terms like this. So particularly when we're talking about the privacy space, you hear this word privacy. You've seen a lot of talks in which this word is used over and over again. So we talk about information privacy, or we talk about boosting your credit protection, or people worry about being a victim of identity theft. as opposed to keeping certain information private, or protecting your credit, or protecting yourself from identity thieves. The issue here is that here we're talking about abstractions, as opposed to the actual tangible processes or the actors that are doing things to you. In a very simple survey that I ran not too long ago, I asked people a series of questions, and I would frame them either in terms of nominalization, that nouning I was talking about, or in terms of the simple verbs or adjectives that are used to describe them. And I asked people rate how important these issues were. And invariably, when you frame it in terms of a nominalization, people think it's less important. So people, if you say how important to you is personal information privacy, they think it's less important than it's important to keep your personal information private. They find computer security less important than keeping your computer secure. Credit protection less than protecting your credit. Because you're moving into the realm of abstraction, and you're largely putting them to sleep. Now, one that I'm going to rule out, or I'm going to talk about in some detail, is the notion of an identity theft. We hear a lot about identity theft. And in fact, here's a search on Google I did just a couple of days ago. And if you type in identity theft as a search phrase, I came up with about 105 million hits. It's interesting, if you take a look at identity thief or identity thieves, those actors who perpetrate such crimes, that if you add those together, that adds to about 3 million. You have everyone's talking about identity theft, but they're not talking about identity thieves. Now, why should you care? Well, and just to reinforce the point, if you take a look at publications that the United States government puts out by the Federal Trade Commission, by the FBI, and other groups that have an interest, Department of Justice, that have an interest in trying to protect people from this issue, they invariably will talk far more about theft than they talk about a thief or thieves. Well, the difference is, of course, that a theft is an abstraction, and it's something that's already happened. A thief is a predator that's coming at you. If you're actually trying to get people to worry about something, if you're getting people to be concerned about this issue, it makes sense to put it in terms of the tangible actor that's working to steal something from you. And to demonstrate this, a group of students and I actually created some information. We created an information tutorial about identity theft, and here you can see a page of it. And all we did here is we created two versions of this, and they differed by one word. That is, whether we talked about how common identity thieves are, and how identity thieves are quickly becoming the most common and costly criminals in the United States, as opposed to the canonical, how common is identity theft? Identity theft is quickly becoming the most common and costly crime in the United States. So, as I say, we only manipulated one word in the difference between these flyers, and then afterwards we asked people to judge their concern, their perceptions of this particular type of cybercrime, and what they would do to protect themselves. And invariably we found that people's perceptions of the severity of the threat, how vulnerable they personally felt to the threat, how important they thought it was to protect themselves from this threat, that they all felt more concern under the thieves framing than they did under the theft framing. And this largely seemed to be mediated by how interesting they found the material. Even though it's just one word different, thinking in terms of thief, this thing, this person that is acting towards you, boosted the interest of this material. People can think more concretely in terms of thieves. So, questions? So, the takeaway from this particular study is, hail to the thief. Talk in terms of the concrete actors that are performing the actions, as opposed to an abstract description of what they're doing. Things like people respond to thief and private better than they respond to theft and privacy. So, fairly simple takeaway there. The second frame that I want to talk about is anchoring, the so-called anchoring and adjustment heuristic. And the basic idea of anchoring is anchoring occurs when people estimate an unknown quantity, and it could be the probability that something will happen, or how much something costs, or how many instances there are of something in the world. And when people don't know the quantity, they're going to base it on known ones. That's fairly straightforward. We all base what we don't know to some extent on what we know. The problem with anchoring is that sometimes people will base their judgments of this unknown quantity on fairly arbitrary anchor values. And this was the basis of some important behavioral economic work, but let's go through an example. So here I have a picture of the Beefeater Signature Grill 6-burner barbecue grill. What do you think this cost? $3,000. $3,000. Do I hear 4? Huh? $1,500. Any other judgments? Any other guesses? Well, what if I were to tell you that in Barbecue Grill Guide, the list price is $59.84? $59.84. Does that seem high? Does it seem high? Well, what if I were to tell you actually that if you look at the ad in barbecuegrill.guide.com, it said $59.84 is the current price. It had been actually reduced by about $600. That its original price was $65.99. Still feel that's high? What if I were to tell you that part of the ad is it said, look, this is the lowest price on the web and shipping is free? How about if I tell you that in the advertisement that it was actually right below it was they had the Beef Signature gold-plated edition that was selling for $12,500. Right. That's right. This looks like the kind of thing, that Cleopatra would have used. What's that? Right. So the point here is that when you took a look at this grill, no one came up with a number like that. Most of the judgments I heard were lower. But of course, when we're estimating the value of a grill, most of us don't know what it costs to make this. Our judgment of its value, of its actual monetary value, we have strong uncertainty about it. And we tend to predicate some judgment of what that value is, whether something's priced high or low, on the basis of information we're given. So everybody thinks it's high after I ask them to guess, but if you had seen this particular advertisement and it showed you that it had been marked down a few $100s, that it's a lot less than the gold-plated edition, you might assume that it's actually a reasonable price or more reasonable price. And this is for a tangible thing that you actually might do to make a very nice dinner. But think about the privacy space. What is your privacy worth? How is your typical consumer even going to make this decision? What is in terms of when they're judging, okay, well, am I willing to give somebody my personally identifiable information, give it to some company, and then I'm going to get a discount? Well, how much of a discount do I deserve for that? What should I pay for identity theft protection? There are a multitude of services. What should I be paying per year? Well, I took a look a couple of days ago at what ID theft protection services cost per year, their yearly subscription rates, and there's quite a range. So there are some credit cards you can get in which you get automatic identity theft protection with it. There are some companies like LifeLock that have sort of a basic plan and a deluxe plan, so they have LifeLock Basic versus LifeLock Ultimate. They differ in terms of price. They differ in terms of the attributes, the sort of protections that they offer you. But there's quite a range here, going from nothing to, or nothing extra, versus $50, $60 to up to $300. Quite a range. Now, how is a consumer to decide whether this is a price, whether it's worth this much? Which one of these should I have? Is it always the case that more is better? And the issue is that when people are making a judgment of value here, they're basing it on the anchor values that are provided in the environment. Now, all of these you might say, well, I'm sure they have a team of economists and finance people that are judging the value, whether these things are really worth that value. And that might very well be. But the consumer doesn't necessarily know that. And importantly, a consumer might make a decision on something that's purely arbitrary. So to show this, I ran a little study a couple of weeks ago in which I asked about 220 people in an online sample, an online panel. And what I did is I created a little fictional ID theft protection service that I called ID Eagle, and I took a bunch of attributes from the various sorts of ID theft protection services that are available, and I gave them a description of it. And then I asked them, as I said, think of the last 3 digits of your Social Security number. Think of that, last 3 digits. Would you be willing to pay that much money for a year's subscription to this ID theft service? So, if you have the example, suppose your last 3 digits are 572. Would you be willing to pay $572 for a year subscription to the service? Now, let's gloss over the fact that these people were giving me the last 3 digits of their Social Security number. Already we've got some problems in understanding what your privacy is worth. But if you get beyond that particularly not very good decision, you find that, not surprisingly, people in the low range, so people whose last 3 digits of their Social Security number, an arbitrary number I should add, that, you know, when their number is between 0 and 99, you're getting a majority of them would pay that per year. When you go to the 199, still in the majority. But as the last 3 digits go up, they're less likely to pay it. So no one, basically after 600, was willing to actually pay that much per year for a subscription to this particular identity theft protection service. That shouldn't be surprising. However, to the people that said no, that they weren't willing to pay it, I asked, okay, if you're not willing to pay that, what is the most you would be willing to pay for an ID theft subscription service? And you find that the anchor value nevertheless has a big impact on how they value their privacy, such that somebody who rejected 972, I'm not going to pay $972 a year for a subscription to this service, say, well, what's the most you'd be willing to pay? Well, I'd be willing to pay about $420. Whereas if I had somebody and they were judging that the last 3 digits were 267, well, I'm not willing to pay that, but I'd pay like $200. So here, the anchor value they have, despite it being based on something that has nothing to do with privacy, it's the last 3 digits of your Social Security number, nevertheless has a profound and large effect on what people judge they're willing to pay for such a service. So the takeaway here, or the takeaway there are 2. First, that consumers are uncertain about the monetary value of their privacy. They don't know this. This is even harder to value than the price of a gold-plated barbecue grill. And the judgments, by virtue of people being so uncertain about it, the judgments of its value are going to be really sensitive to contextual cues, even arbitrary ones. So, any questions? So I'm going to talk about the last 2 in conjunction, loss aversion and endowment, because they're related in their impact on privacy at least. And so I'll introduce them each initially, and then I will take them into the realm of privacy. So loss aversion. Loss aversion, this notion was explored by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, both cognitive psychologists. Kahneman ultimately won the Nobel Prize for this a few years ago in his prospect theory research. But the loss aversion, the idea is very simple. Loss aversion, people experience a loss more intensely than a gain of equal value. So the mantra you hear among prospect theorists is that losses loom larger than gains. People feel the pain of losing $100 more intensely than they feel the excitement of gaining $100. And this aversion to loss has an important impact on behavior, which is that people will take risks, are more likely to take risks, to avert the anticipated pain of a loss in a way that they won't necessarily do work to secure a gain. So Kahneman and Tversky studied this in a variety of different domains, and their various students have studied it. I'll show you a very simple example of how this can generate a massive framing effect, which is a very simple study, 2-phase little study in which in the first phase people were given $50. They said, we're giving you $50 to play a game. And in the second phase of the game, after they get the $50, they were randomly assigned to one of 2 different game versions. So in game number 1, they're told you have 2 options. You can keep $20, or you can gamble it all, with the chance of keeping or losing all the money. You have a 50-50 chance. So basically a coin toss. If it comes up heads, you get the 50 bucks. If it comes up tails, you get nothing. In game 2, they're told that your option A is that you could lose $30 of the 50 you were given. And option B is you can gamble it with a 50-50 chance of either keeping it all or losing it all. Now, of course, you see here that what is the difference between these games? None. The difference between these games is a word, either the word keep or the word lose. But if you started with $50 and you keep 20, then you're losing 30. If you lose $30, then you're keeping 20. So the only difference here between these two is a word. But this word has a significant effect on how people actually make decisions about choosing options. And that you find under the loss frame here that there are more people willing to actually take this gamble. That they will actually take a risk, and about 20% more likely to take a risk to actually avoid this loss. Whereas the people who, when it's framed in terms of gaining something, you get to keep this $20, they are far more likely to actually be risk averse and stay with what they have, despite it being exactly the same scenario with just different wording. Now, endowment actually grows out of loss aversion. And yes, I think that Gollum is sort of the ultimate symbol of the endowment effect. And again, another very simple concept, which is that people place a higher value on goods that they have than on those they don't have. And here, this is demonstrated in a variety of studies in which you show that people, if they have something that they currently own, the money that they're willing to sell it for, that they're willing to accept to give it up, invariably is more than the amount of money they'd be willing to buy that exact thing from someone else. And of course, endowment, which you could say is ownership adds value, that's a good way to put it. The basis of loss aversion is endowment. You can only lose what you already own, what you already have. So as I said, there are a variety of studies demonstrating this. Certainly the most famous demonstration that Carmon and his colleagues did, they were in a college classroom and they gave people a nice mug, a nice coffee mug. That is, they gave half the audience. So every other student in the audience, they gave that person a coffee mug. Of course, every other student didn't get one. And so what they did is they asked the people who had a mug, they owned the mug, and those that didn't have them, is they said, how much is that mug worth? And the people that had one overall rated it as about twice as value as those who didn't have it. Merely owning it seemed to actually increase its value. Dan Ariely and one of his students at Duke University found an even more spectacular effect when they looked at people who either had tickets to Duke basketball games and had to come up with a value for these tickets, versus people who don't have the tickets and the price that they would be willing to pay. And they found a price differential or a valuation differential here on the order of about 14, that people who have the tickets and the price they'd be willing to sell them was far higher than people who didn't have them and would be willing to pay. It's also been demonstrated that you get an endowment effect in non-human primates. So Brosnan and her colleagues actually, what they did is they had chimpanzees, and the chimpanzees had at the very beginning of the study, they were either given, they either had a choice between two treats, some peanut butter or a frozen juice stick. And in two different versions of the experiment, they would actually give them one treat first. So they give them the peanut butter, and then after they have that, they say, well, you want to trade this? So they give them the option of actually trading it for the juice stick. And when they start out with the peanut butter, most of them want to stay with the peanut butter. However, if you started out with the frozen juice stick, and you said, would you trade it for peanut butter? Very, very few choose the peanut butter, because I started out with the juice stick. So you see something like endowment even in non-humans. So, how does this bear on privacy? Well, it bears on the assumptions that people are making about whether privacy is something that they have, or that they're going to retain, or something that they need to buy back. And this was demonstrated in a wonderful experiment by Alessandro Acquisti and his colleagues at Carnegie Mellon University a few years ago. What they did was they gave people the gift of this was a gift card, and this was a reward that they got for participating in a consumer survey. And people were given one of two different types of cards. One was, it was a gift card for $10, and it was an anonymous card. And so people could use this to buy anything they want that they could use Visa to buy, and it was anonymous in the sense that their name would not be linked to any purchases they made with this card. In contrast, the identified card, which is a little bit more, it's $12, they could again use this $12 to buy anything they want, but their name would be linked to whatever purchase they made with this card. So, Acquisti and his colleagues offered people these cards in three different scenarios. In the first scenario, they just gave the people the option. Would you like the $10 anonymous card or the $12 identified card? So this is an open choice. You can just choose between them. In the second scenario, people were initially given the $10 anonymous card. So they own it. And here I'm talking about ownership that lasts on the order of about a minute. We're not talking about very long ownership here. And after that minute, people are given the options. Well, you can keep the anonymous card we gave you, or you can exchange it for the $12 identified card. Now, when you think about that, you're going to exchange this $10 anonymous card for a $12 identified card. You're effectively selling your personal information for $2, right? So you're going to get more gift card, but you have to give up your personal information. And in the third scenario, it's just the opposite. So initially, people are given the $12 identified card, and after a minute of ownership, they're given the option of either keeping the identified card, or they can trade it for this $10 card, this $10 anonymous card. And so since you're starting out with more money on the identified card, you're effectively paying. You're paying $2 to keep your privacy. And what Alessandro and his colleagues, Professor Acquisti and his colleagues found here was quite impressive, which is that in the open choice situation, in which people could just choose between the two, there was a slight preference for the identified card. So people would prefer to get money with identification than the privacy that comes with it. However, when you endowed the anonymous card by effectively just giving it to people first, a slim majority wanted to keep it. They wanted to keep it. They were not willing to actually exchange the anonymous card for the identified one. However, when you started out with the identified card, very, very, very few people wanted to trade it for the endowed card, or excuse me, for the anonymous card. So the implications here are very important for privacy. Is how people value privacy critically depends on what their initial assumption is. Effectively, privacy is valued more to keep than to buy back, as I think demonstrated effectively in that study. And it also points to the psychological impact of free trials of services. So there are a variety of free trials of services. You know, things like Spotify, in which you get this vast music library, but you also get lots of people getting to see what's you're playing in your music library. When you subscribe to something like LifeLock, which of course gives you is a value of privacy, you own that if you take the 30-day free trial subscription to LifeLock. And by virtue of owning it, you might be that much less likely to actually give it up once you own it. So, I've talked about 4 different anchoring effects and how they might have an impact on privacy decisions. And I'll just review them. So first I talked about nominalization, this idea that abstraction induces apathy. So in terms of ways to countermand the effects of these framing devices, it's pretty simple. Particularly, I'm going to talk about these mainly from a consumer education standpoint. And so I strongly would advise talking to people, talking to consumers, not necessarily the tech gurus that are working for your companies or the academics that are doing research on this, that you talk in very simple terms. You talk about protecting people from identity thieves. You talk about getting people to keep information private, securing your computers, as opposed to things like privacy, theft, and security. Anchoring. I described anchoring as a situation in which a naive valuation is context sensitive. If you're not a finance or economics expert and you're trying to value a good, particularly when the good, the asset, is privacy, you are likely to be highly sensitive to contextual cues. And here the advice for educated consumers is to encourage them to scrutinize anchor values. So if people are making a judgment about that value, say, where do you think that number came from? You know, that this service cost $200. Well, why not compare it to some of the other identity theft protection services that are out there? And when people actually do some comparison shopping, they might actually say to themselves, I'm not sure that I'm really going to get that much more value by spending $300 than this service by $100. You certainly don't want people to somehow treat that number as being gospel in terms of what the actual value of their privacy is worth. The last two framing factors that I talked about, loss aversion and endowment. So I described loss aversion as the phenomenon that we tend to perceive losses as looming larger than gains, and with endowment that ownership adds value. So the way that you might educate consumers in a way that's going to, if not protect them, is mitigate these sorts of framing effects, is to promote private information as an asset. You can get people to think about private information as an asset, one that they currently own, and that's key, because as I talked about, people will pay to retain privacy more than they will to buy it back if they think that they've lost it. And so framing it as an asset that they currently own is probably going to make them value it more. Now, that said, there are some problems with thinking of privacy merely as an asset, but nevertheless, that's something that we can talk about in Q&A if you'd like. So at that point, I think I've said enough. I thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any questions.